welcome. I'm Nicola Dyer, and I'm the Senior Advisor at the Global Seaweed Coalition. It's my pleasure to guide this conversation today. I have a feeling we're going to be joined by a few more people as time goes on, but let's get started. On behalf of the organizing partners, let me welcome you all to this regional workshop on seaweed contaminants, organized by Lydiane Mathieu of Blue Seaweed, great name, by the way, which led the South Passy project, also a great name, in collaboration with Laurent Lagourgue from Caledonia and funding from the Global Seaweed Coalition, or GSC. This workshop is part of the GSC's ongoing series of scientific workshops and webinars. The objectives of today's workshop are, one, to share the findings of the South Passy project, two, to identify gaps in knowledge about seaweed contaminants in the South Pacific region, and three, to discuss an important recommendation that emerged from the project, which is to create a regional working group on seaweed contaminants with the aim of agreeing and establishing common regional standards. So a couple of quick housekeeping details. You're used to this, but anyway, here we go. Before we get into the substance, please let us know who you are by where you're joining from in your institutional affiliation. Some of you have already done that in the little pre-session, but please post that in the chat. And throughout, please feel free to post your comments or questions in the chat. We will be monitoring it, and so will the speakers. They'll either respond directly in the chat, or my colleagues will flag them to me, or I'll notice them, and we'll air them during the Q&A portions. And as you'll just have seen and heard, we are recording this. So by pressing the got it or the okay or whatever it was, then you have expressed your consent to the recording. And we do it because we want to be able to share this afterwards with other interested stakeholders. If for any reason you have any concerns about the recording, then and you'd still like to stay with us, you always do have the option to keep yourself muted and to keep your camera off. And we do hope that you'll stay with us throughout, and we do hope that you'll participate as well. So with that, quick word about the Global Seaweed Coalition, which I'm delighted to represent here. GSC is a global partnership established to support the safe and sustainable scale-up of the seaweed sector, grounded in science. Our founding partners are Lloyd's Register Foundation, which provided GSC with initial funding of £3 million for the coalition. Our scientific partner, the French National Research Center, or CNRS, and our host since last year, the United Nations Global Compact. We have 4 action pillars. 1, we deliver seed funding through competitive calls for proposals. To date, we've provided €1.5 million in seed funding to 32 projects in 27 countries. 2, we carry out advocacy on behalf of the seaweed sector, a lot of advocacy. 3, we support cutting-edge seaweed science and technology. And 4, we engage increasingly on policy issues that are relevant to seaweed. And we benefit from the active engagement of our 2 advisory councils, our scientific council, which is composed of renowned seaweed experts from around the globe, couple of whom I believe are on this call. Yes, we've got a couple of our scientific council members here, and we do expect that the chair of our strategic advisory council will be joining us soon. So yes, Flower, thank you very much for putting on your camera. Let's just give a little shout out to our scientific council members, Flower Msuya and Alan Critchley, who are joining us today or tonight for you. Thank you. For you, Flower, really late for you. Thank you. And Alan, it's evening for you. So we really, really appreciate your joining. Our Strategic Advisory Council works in complement to the Scientific Council, provides strategic guidance and perspectives on global developments and opportunities that are relevant to seaweed. It's not composed of seaweed experts, it's composed of seaweed fans, if you will, those who are really interested in the seaweed sector and who can complement the work by helping us to see where seaweed can fit in global conversations and to flag strategic opportunities for us. And then there's a small secretariat that carries out the coalition's day-to-day work. We have a couple of secretariat team members here, our fantabulous scientific team, led by our even more fantabulous scientific director, Philippe Potin, who's not used to my referring to him that way. So, Philippe.
Hello, everyone. Very pleased to be with you, Nicola. And let now introduce the most important person in the scientific team.
And our fantabulous scientific officer, Melanie Kreff.
Hi, everyone.
And then you're both, well, ordinarily you'd be joining us from Roscoff, but I gather that you are en route to to an interesting location, which you may or may not divulge later on. So Melanie, if she hasn't already, is going to be posting some additional information about the coalition in the chat, a link to our website if you don't already know it, as well as some information about some projects that we financed that are relevant to the conversation today. And speaking about projects, let me just give a quick word about the South Pas Seaweed project, which Lydiane is going to go into more detail about later on. It was led by Blue Seaweed, and it's in the second cohort of GSC's funded projects. The team worked on identifying key seaweed species that are suitable for cultivation in the South Pacific Islands, and they conducted analyses of seaweed contaminants in the region. And the findings from this project are expected to inform some important discussions for us regarding the inclusion of seaweed in the Codex Alimentarius. All right, soon I'm going to stop talking, but let me just take you through the agenda first. This workshop is going to take place in two parts. So the first is going to be with context on seaweed safety and regional specificities. We're going to hear from some great speakers. And then we'll have a session to brainstorm what might be needed to establish a safe seaweed industry in the region. So part one, we're going to break up into a couple of parts. We'll start with a group of three presentations. First, with a general presentation on seaweed safety from Esther Garrido Gamaro, and I'm not sure whether I probably did not pronounce that very well, but of the food. Oh, thank you. Of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. Followed by an overview of the seaweed industry in the South Pacific by Jamie Whitford of the Pacific Community, or SPC. And I hope you're going to share a little bit about what SPC is as well. And Nick Paul of the University of the Sunshine Coast, who's already been a speaker in one of our scientific webinars. He's going to wrap this portion up with insights on seaweed production and consumption in Fiji, Samoa, and Kiribati. After these three presentations, we'll pause for Q&A. We'll do about a 5-minute Q&A. Feel free to post questions in the chat. And speakers, please feel free to respond in the chat, but let's take 5 minutes for discussion related. Then we'll turn to Pia Winberg of FICO Health, who will talk about seaweed in Australia. And then Corentin Salvon of Rimu Solutions. He's going to share about Gracilaria farming in Tahiti. And then we'll take another round of questions. And then the part that we've all been waiting for is to close out part one. We're going to hear from Lydiane, who's going to be teeing up our brainstorming discussion by presenting the main findings of the South Pas Seaweed project. And once again, we'll pause for some Q&A so that if you've got any burning questions for Lydiane at that point, then she can respond to them. Then, before we go into the brainstorming, well, actually, before we go into the presentations, we need to take a quick pause for a group photo. So if you can, if your cameras are working, could you all please turn them on? Melanie is going to do the honors this time. So she's going to guide us through when we should show our pearly whites and say seaweed.
Yes, can you please hold on your camera? I'm not very used to that, but
And
Thank
seaweed
you
has
so much.
two E's. So
So
seaweed.
please smile. I see a couple of faces.
Oh, c'est
Thank
bon,
you.
ouais,
It's
c'est bien.
dark in some places. Thank you. It's all done.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So with that, then let me turn to Esther to give us the context on safety. Esther of FAO, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Because of the technical issues and the time that I could not get, of course, any IT support at this time in Rome, I cannot access my presentation, but I see that it's already there. So thank you very much. I would just say pass. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of our work and why we started it, which was basically because we saw that the both production and international trade were growing and growing and growing, and we did not have any codex guidance with regards to seaweed. There are many types of codex guidance. I'm gonna go through the different types of codex guidance that one can develop, but there was nothing. And on top of this, regulations with regards to contaminants were completely different depending on the country when they existed. In most cases, they do not even exist. So we started to worry a little bit. Please pass. Thank you. Yeah, these are some figures. Probably you know about them because these are figures from our latest Sophia report. Next one. So we propose new work to the Codex Committee on Fish and Fishery Products on seaweed, and they say, okay, we understand this is important, but we want to have a document highlighting from FAO and WHO what are the main food safety issues that we can find with regard to seaweed. So we did. And this report was published right after the last Codex Committee on Fish and Fishery Products. It will be presented tomorrow. This week is the next session of the Codex Committee on Fish and Fishery Products. And the reports highlight some of the issues with regards to contaminants and pathogens, etc., etc. Next, Melanie, please. So these are some of the issues that were highlighted in the report. So of course, heavy metals, iodine, pesticide residues, radionuclides, persistent organic pollutants, allergens, biotoxins. All these things are not just highlighted as issues, but they are somehow discussed. And it gives you an idea of how much importance and we have to give it to develop a codex standards with regards to seaweed. Also, some microbiological hazards were highlighted because in most regions, products are consumed basically dry, but it's not the case for all the regions or all the countries, and also some physical hazards. And now I'm going to very quickly give you an example of what decisions Codex can take tomorrow and the day after. Next, please, Melanie, because they might decide to go ahead with standards for setting, for example, mLs, so maximum levels for certain contaminants, and included in 193 standard, which is something that to me could make sense. Next. But they can also decide to go ahead and develop standards for certain seaweed species with regard, I mean, it can be any seaweed species or a specific processing type or very specific provisions concerning, for example, the quality or sizing, or establishing very clear definition of what a product should be, or provisions for tolerances, even provisions of contaminants for a specific species, provisions concerning presentation, etc., etc. I brought this example of corn because I think it relates pretty much to a terrestrial vegetable than fish itself, but I also brought another example for dry shark fins. You can pass to, Melanie, where they have provisions for essential composition and quality factors, labeling food additives that you can use, hygiene and handling, how you can do it, etc., etc. So these are the sort of standards that one can think about developing when it comes to seaweed, but there are also codes of practice. So pass until you reach to slide number 10, Melanie, please. And we have our own code of practice of fish and fishery products. Codex might decide to develop one with a number of products and processes for seaweed. Next, please. And there you can see the sort of content that a code of practice can contain. So from very basic definitions to general consideration for handling, to the provision of examples when it comes to HACCP implementation for specific products. Next, Melanie, please. How to harvest, how to process, how to storage, how to distribute certain products. So it goes a little bit farther. It goes even as deep as how to carry out food safety management, let's say, with regards to the product. And also gives you details about how you can transport the product, how the reception should be in retail. I mean, it can be very, very specific. Or they might decide, please go to slide number 15, Melanie. They might decide to develop other sort of instruments and tools. We have, for example, the Mother Certificate for Fish and Fishery Products. We have guidelines for the sensory evaluation of fish and shellfish in laboratories. I mean, it's pretty much open what they can decide during this session. We don't know. We will be presenting this agenda item together with many others in the area of scientific advice tomorrow to the committee, and they might decide to take it on board or not. I must say that I'm a bit surprised because I talked to Melanie when she was here in Rome a couple of weeks ago. I'm very surprised that even though we have put together this report and there is very clear information about what FAO would be expecting and why, and WHO, and we know about the needs of the industry and the countries with regards to having very clear standards or international standards for seaweed. This has not translated in a lot of interventions from member countries, Codex member states saying we support this work and we are coming with very clear the ideas of what we need. Having said that, and knowing that I'm now in a workshop full of people that might have or could influence these sort of processes, as I said to Melanie, there are Codex contact points. I think I can send you even the link where you can find all the Codex contact points. There is one for every country. And you are still on time to influence these sort of processes. The agenda item will be presented tomorrow at 11 Rome time. And if you believe that your country can benefit and the industry in your country can benefit from having a specific Codex standard, you are still on time to contact your Codex contact point and raise this issue. It can also be raised under agenda item 5, which is not happening tomorrow, but the day after, and any other business. I think that could be also acceptable for the Codex Secretariat. And with this, I just leave you with the last slide, slide 17, Melanie. Next, this one, to tell you that we are now working on a new report that puts not only the risk, but also the benefits of consuming seaweed in perspective, and basically builds on what has been already done, but it contains aspects related to nutrition and biosecurity as well. If there are any questions, or I've heard that they might be later, I'm happy to respond. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Esther. And yes, if you can just hold off your questions, or feel free to put them in the chat, and really appreciate your calling on people to alert their Codex representatives, their country representatives. And just as news for some of you, you may not be aware, we learned during Climate Week in New York and the UN General Assembly that Indonesia is willing to support the creation, to call for the creation of a United Nations task force to support the development of the seaweed sector. And so if Indonesia is an active participant in Codex discussions, we can have an offline discussion about that. But now let me turn to Jamie. Jamie, you've got 7-ish minutes to share with us developments on the seaweed industry in the region. Thanks. Over to you.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. I've got my presentation down, but someone else is sharing.
Yeah, I've got your presentation, I think, Jamie, but
Yeah, I
happy
just
for you
cut
to
out a few slides to make it so it's easier for me to share.
floor is yours.
Okay. That's okay for everyone?
Yes.
Now it is.
Okay. So I'm Jamie Whitford. I'm the mariculture specialist for the Pacific community in New Caledonia and Fiji. I'm not particularly a seaweed expert. I'm covering all mariculture issues in the Pacific. But I do know something about seaweed. I was based in Kiribati a long time in 2000. For the Pacific, most of the industry in the last 20 or 30 years has been based around Capophycus production for export for for gels and for the pharmaceutical industry. Kiribati and Fiji had large productions in the 2000s, but that's declined recently. There's been stability and growth in the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. There's also domestic markets based around mainly calopa. A lot of that's not aquaculture production, that's wild fishery. In most domestic markets, we find calopa. Tonga has mazuka production there. It's endemic species around the Pacific. That's kind of a little bit fortuitous for them. They have a connection to Japan, and so they've got a small kind of industry exporting processed product to Japan. Most of the problems with the development of seaweed in the Pacific, a lot that has been supported by donors extensively as supply chains, even for basics like ropes and ties, and the seed stock itself have been really delicate. And the market is also inaccessible in a lot of cases, and so buyers tend to be rare domestically, and export opportunities and domestic shipping are kind of making things quite difficult. So we still find most of the seaweed industries, if not all, in the Pacific Islands still need government and partner support to keep going. This is what I got, a couple of years ago now from the statistics that we have available, and a lot of it is not great. So FAO are kind of getting data from fisheries departments, but fisheries departments often don't have the resources for great data collection. We are working on that. But we can see that, yeah, there's a number of countries that are involved, mainly here in Caprificus production. Australia and New Zealand, I include just to show how tiny their industries are, despite their technological capability compared to some other places. Solomon Islands here is the standout. Again, there's been a real push for government and their partners to keep that industry going. But we can see there's mainly been a decline over the last few years that I have data for, mainly because of domestic supply and transportation issues, and also the price remains quite low. There are other things that happen in the Pacific. So places like Kiribati, the government decided a number of years ago to subsidise the price of copra production. And so a lot of people who have been working in seaweed previously switch immediately to copra. These sort of efforts are quite sensitive to other things that are going on, particularly in outer islands. The same applies to the opening and closure of sea cucumber or beach demur fisheries. And so when a beach demur fishery is opened, particularly on an outer island, most of the effort will go into that and seaweed production will falter. What tends to happen then is that seaweed production decreases so rapidly into such a low level that restarting it is almost sort of starting from the beginning as far as seed stock and distribution goes. So again, it's still like a good sphere of aquaculture, particularly to try and work on in the Pacific. And I would point out that aquaculture industries, even in developed countries, tend to take 20 or 30 years of government support to get going. So yeah, one thing about it is participation of women is quite high that we find, and it's easy for people in outer islands and quite isolated areas to access seaweed farming compared to some other ideas that have been around. And it has had in the past a very large economic benefit for people when things have kind of clicked together. There are examples in isolated atolls in Kiribati and Fanning Island close to Hawaii, where yeah, more than 100 metric tons, I think, have been produced from one atoll. So when things lined up, yeah, things work quite well in the Pacific. A lot of our work recently has been about product diversification, so that kind of, I guess, melds quite well with the project that we're talking about at the moment. We find there's a lot of interest in Caledonia marketing. It's marketed domestically in most Pacific countries. There are problems with shelf life and things like that when we turn to aquaculture production. But we have been doing culture trials in various countries to try and take the pressure off what is really a wild fishery for Caledonia. Mazuku in Tonga, again, as I mentioned, it's quite I guess, a fortuitous situation for them when they have the personal connection to the Japanese export market. And they're looking at other things like pharmaceutical markets in the Pacific Rim. And again, value adding is important for them. And we have done work in the Solomons where we're trying to look at some of the Caprificus production, if it can be diverted into some domestic nutritional benefit, mainly because they're having good success with production in a lot of these countries, but when things like buyers disappear or domestic shipping costs increase, it's kind of like a knife edge. Production will disappear quite rapidly when the economic benefit doesn't exist anymore. There's no continuation through hard times. The industry will just stop. And so that's kind of our work, is trying to look at domestic markets if it's possible to develop them. There's also an increasing interest in the neighbours of the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand. So as our populations change through immigration and awareness of the health benefits of seaweed, there's a renewed interest in consuming seaweed, and these adjacent markets might work out better than the pharmaceutical and food industry markets that have been traditionally accessed by places like Kiribati and the Solomons, which tend to be not in Australia and New Zealand, but in Europe and the US. And so, one particular example that we worked on was the Solomon Islands, and again, that's based around Capophycus production, and it has previously been a main source of income in isolated areas. There are still problems. There are environmental problems as well. Things like, I think, El Nino for Kiribati tends to change wind directions and tends to make sites that were previously useful for seaweed farming more hard to manage with wave action, and also temperature increases attributed to global warming are causing more disease issues and stuff like that with Capophycus production. So again, we're trying to look at value adding and trying to divert some of this activity into domestic markets. When we do this work, we do find a lot of interest, and we do find that the techniques and the methodology is applicable to quite isolated areas. Again, it's just trying to keep the message going that consuming seaweed is healthy, and trying to sort of inject this kind of new commodity often into local diets. Local diets in isolated areas have been dominated in the Pacific by imported food increasingly, and a lot of it is due to the cost pressure of producing local foods when supply chains, particularly for fuel, are quite getting more and more expensive, and so imported cheap food, particularly from China, becomes the cheapest alternative. So for the Pacific, as you can see, in Kiribati previously, production was quite large and well managed with the help of donor assistance. We need to reconnect with buyers, and so this is the common problem in places like Solomon Islands, Fiji and Kiribati. When there's no locally based buyer, then the market just kind of disappears, and production will disappear quite rapidly while people turn to other things. And then, just trying to look at new products. And so this work that has been done for this project is quite interesting for us to see if anything else will crop up. And then I have a video if there's time, but we can forgo it.
I don't think there's going to be time for that, which is too bad because it looks like it might be.
That's all right.
But if we have time at the end, we can try that. But thank you, and thanks for flagging the data issues, which is one of the policy areas that we've been taking up, because FAO publishes the seaweed data, but it doesn't invent it. It receives the data from member states, and the quality that is published depends crucially on the quality of what is submitted. So let me turn now to Nick. Nick, you have 7 minutes, and I'm going to be watching. So over to you.
Very good. Thanks, Nicola. And thanks, Jamie, actually, for the overview of the introduction of seaweed across the Pacific. It makes my job a little bit easier. I'm from the University of the Sunshine Coast here in Australia. We have a large group of people working on all things to do with seaweed, not just on the technical farming side, but also around products and business angles, and also socio-economic. So we're based sort of below the equator here, and most of our work on the Sunshine Coast focuses on warm water species. So we have been working across the Pacific Islands, in Northern Australia too, and in Indonesia for the last 15 or so years. So I thought for today, while I haven't been specifically looking at contaminants as part of any of those projects, it's always there, and certainly things that we're measuring and quantifying, and some of those aspects might be interesting to people here. So we've got a new project, and just to highlight that at the moment, it's building on a whole lot of work that we've been doing, but it's funded by the IDRC, so from Canada. And it's all about looking at transforming women's seaweed businesses in Fiji, Samoa, and Kiribati. And as Jamie mentioned just in the previous talk, it really is seaweed business is women's business in the Pacific. And so we're working with a range of different partners, so all of the fisheries departments in each of those countries. We have Sepeti Ta'iti online as well, who can contribute into discussions, as well as Fiji National University based in Fiji too. There's a range of different partners there, and some of you may recognize those people, so also feel free to reach out to them. So my overview is really a picture collage of a lot of the work that we've been doing across the Pacific, just to make sure that everyone's sort of aligned with where aquaculture is at when it comes to seaweed production in the Pacific, but also where all the other opportunities are because of that really strong traditional and cultural knowledge around use of seaweed, which is really important to recognize. When it comes to Kappa ficus production, so it's the same species that's produced in Indonesia. It was all introduced to the Pacific in the 1980s and 90s, and sometimes more recently of different strains by SPC. But it's very simple production. This is Kappa ficus alvarezi growing up in the Osawa Islands in Fiji. You can see lines, posts, and just off bottom production going on there. When we first started doing work on Kappa ficus in Fiji, it was through a period of scale up and interest in production. So a lot of the times, just like in Indonesia and across Southeast Asia, it's quite a family business where everyone, men, women, and children, are often involved in various aspects of the supply chain. There was a lot of interest back in 2014 and scale up. But unfortunately, a couple of extreme weather events, Cyclone Winston came through, took out production. As Jamie mentioned, it's really hard to pick it back up once tools are dropped. But that's happening right now. We're lucky the Ministry of Fisheries in Fiji is again starting that really tight relationship that exists between government and establishing production in the villages. And so what we can see on the right there is sacco, so Kappa ficus striatum being produced close to sort of estuarine environments near Suva. The main thing when you think about seaweed in the Pacific is actually food and really strong cultural connections. One of the things that we realized very early on, though, is while all the common names, as in language, are well known, the scientific links to those are not so clear. There are many, many different species of caulerpa, so sea grapes, and up until recent project, we didn't actually know how many, but we still don't actually have that direct link to things. So we have to remember that when we're talking about contaminants as well, is actually having that strong scientific foundation is really important. But a really quick snapshot back in 2014 of all the seaweeds that you might expect to see. Lumiwawa, that's Gracilaria, or now renamed as standard practice in phycology, to Hydropuntia, a whole new genus. We have Lumi thavata, which is a type of Hypnea, Hypnea conata. There's the sea grapes, about 3 or 4 different species of sea grapes in Fiji, known as Nama, and also some of our favorite friend, which is very easy to produce, called Ova meridionalis, which is called Lumi boso. So the standard setup there for those interested in contaminants and health and the like is a whole lot of seaweeds sitting on the bench top, available for purchase. And this was back in 2014. Basically, they end up with about 200-gram portions, which can sell for Fijian dollars, $2 a plate. But just recently, a couple of weeks ago, we were there for inception meetings, and things have started to change. Prices have gone up, and a whole lot of different packaging, which is really interesting, and we're hoping to unpack. So some of the aspects have remained the same. The supply chain for domestic production of caulerpa, that's the Nama, comes from different places around Vigalevu, but also quite far away in Osawa. So it takes a couple of days to transport in sort of old sacks, recycled sacks, as well as some sort of natural materials. They still sometimes sell them as plates, which will be ticked into a plastic bag with fermented coconut and some chili, very delicious. But what we're starting to see is a whole range of new packaging, which is unfortunately plastic, but we have to look at the promising side of that. There's some drivers clearly around sort of either ready to eat food or also new sort of ways of packaging it for, I suspect, food safety, but time will tell. In Samoa, a lot of the work is similar in terms of the wild harvest of sea grapes. Traditionally, just in the shallow intertidal areas at low tide, women in particular, again, will go out and collect and harvest. And some of the work that the team, including Sepeti, have been doing, and us, is looking at ways of trying to produce the sea grapes. And of course, like everything in science, it's never perfectly clear. There's a couple of different species of caulerpa in Samoa, and only one of them is relatively straightforward to grow in this type of way. The really interesting work that Sepeti and the team in fisheries have done is that they identified there's quite a lot of herbivory happening in some villages that really wanted to have production, and by putting cages around it at certain times of the year, you can get substantial growth. So looking into that cage, we can see a whole lot of caulerpa growing up really quickly, which wouldn't normally happen. So these sea grapes are being packaged in the Apia markets, often wrapped up in breadfruit leaves. They have a shelf life of a few days. Most of the time, people do give it a bit of a rinse before using it, but it's pretty much naturally sort of consumed, as you can see here, the opened up package. But the really nice thing that I like, and it's that sort of thing that Seaweed does, is straddles both the seafood market as well as the fresh food market. So it's a really sort of important angle. A lot of the work in Kiribati, and Jamie mentioned in the previous talk about the Capophycus production. It is very stochastic, up and down. It is starting to grow again, which is awesome. Abayang, the island atoll to the north of Tarawa, the main island in Kiribati, is the main production site on the western side of Kiribati. But one of the things that we're really interested in was using starting to collect seaweed for just for consumption. A lot of the women, again, in particular in Kiribati, some of the older women had recollections of eating seaweed, but for the most part, most people don't glean and eat seaweed in Kiribati. So this is one of these beautiful fish traps that are all across the atolls. They look like amazing hearts as you're flying into the atolls, but in fact, they're a very important and cultural as well as productive way of catching fish. But the great thing for seaweed lovers amongst us is that they also are a fantastic site for seaweed to settle and grow. So we had this wonderful knowledge exchange that we supported between our Samoan colleagues who came and trained women in Kiribati how to handle and process the sea grapes, how to package them, and also all the way through to marketing. And so that recipe angle and being able to develop or being able to be inspired by existing recipes, say in Indonesia and other places, but also to be able to put your own unique spin on it, I think will be a really important thing to factor in when we're talking about the sort of regulation sides as well as what do the people really want to do. Last thoughts, just to leave you, we've done a lot of measurements. There's also a bunch of scientists in the team. All of these product sheets exist now for different countries, for different species, capturing all the main nutritional sort of panel information, as well as a lot of the metals. And I'll just sort of leave you this lasting thought is that sometimes those metals and minerals, trace elements, could be considered contaminants, but other times they might not be. In fact, they might be quite important, and don't underestimate how complex that is, both in terms of the bioavailability of the actual role of different forms of those minerals in our nutrition, as well as the nutrition of crops and the like. And that example on the right is using seaweed-based compost. We're able to change the mineral contents, including a number of key minerals in the tomatoes that are being grown in the very nutrient-poor sands of Kiribati. So a different angle there. So this new project we're developing.
Can you wrap up, please, Nick?
Lots of different. This is the last slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Last slide across these different countries and lots of different villages that are all sort of interested in seaweed. And there's going to be a whole lot of wonderful aspects captured around the supply chain, life cycle analyses to bring that all together, entrepreneurial skills, which we haven't done so much yet, but that key thing, I just wanted to highlight that knowledge sharing, and that is certainly something that I'd be quite interested to contribute into when it comes to regional frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really terrific, really interesting, which is why I let it kind of go on longer than originally foreseen. And you may not have seen, but Flower's already interested in collaboration the Tanzania South Pacific connection. So let's just see quickly if we have any questions. Don't feel obliged to ask a question. We can move on to the next set of presentations if you like. You can always post a question in the chat. But if you have a burning question for any of the presenters, can you please put up your Zoom hand so that I can see you? And I'll do a going once, twice, gone. And if I don't see a Zoom hand, then I'm going to turn back to note how I'm speaking in slow motion. Okay, now, all right, Pia, you are up. Let's turn to you. So we're going to hear from Pia, then Corentin. There'll be another opportunity for questions. Pia, over to you.
Thanks very much, everyone, and hello from Australia. I'm heading to Sydney today, but I come from just a few hours south of Sydney, where I was an academic working in seaweed research and systems, but now I'm a seaweed farmer trying to put into practice what I preach. I would say that one of our presenters just previously showed how small the seaweed industry actually is in Australia today, but there's a lot of noise and activity, and I think one of the things Australia could contribute is that we do have already good standards in food safety, and so maybe that's an area that Australia can contribute. But like every nation, we have our unique species, unique systems, unique markets. And so hopefully what I share today is just a resource that you can keep in mind. Next slide, thanks. Not sure that the next slide's coming, maybe. I'm not in control of the slides here. Great. Yeah, so just to let you know what we do, and also basically what every seaweeds do. We do it very literally. So I catch nutrients and carbon dioxide from existing food processing industries, and we put that directly into the pools of seaweed that we cultivate here in Australia, and we take that seaweed and put it into a range of food products and even biomedical materials that are in development. And this system is very tight and intense for our operation, but it isn't actually different to any of your operations in other parts of the world. It just may be further dispersed, but all nutrients go around this planet and they're all going through seaweeds at the coastline. And so really we all have to face similar issues about understanding where our nutrients and flows come from and go to. We're just a very tight direct connection between these systems. Next slide, please. So we're a little bit different on this next slide. You'll see that as I said, we farm directly, and this is an image of our seaweed coming out of the water that is a combination of seawater as well as nutrient from digesters in large, very large wheat processing plants. And as I said, we catch the carbon dioxide, and our mission is core around sustainability. But following that, we put our food into human food systems, and so nutrition and safety is really important. Next slide, please. The next slide overviews a little bit how we have a series of technologies that we were sort of forced to develop because no one knew what to do with seaweeds here in Australia. And I stood there with bags of green sustainable powder, and the food industry went, oh, what are we supposed to do with that? So I started a brand then, Phyco Health, and we had to learn to dry the seaweed, process the seaweed, put it into foods, understand the food nutrition, labeling, regulations, and take it all the way up the chain. And so today we're an integrated platform from the source to the customer. And therefore have had to cover off many of the food safety issues. You can jump forward 2 slides, and I'll just show you there is the current range of our products. So we sell food, supplements, and skincare products now into a range of stores as well as direct to consumers online. Now, to go to the next 3 slides are really an overview of some things we've had to do to get there. And that is around the safety and nutritional value of the seaweeds. So back in 2017, if we go back a slide again, sorry. So back in 2017, yeah, that one, great. Back in 2017, we published a report based on the sort of technical side of seaweed for safety. And in Australia, we've got very unique seaweed. So some of the seaweeds you see here are only found in Australia. And so we're aware of some of the metal and mineral and safety issues of commonly eaten Asian seaweeds, but in Australia there were many we didn't know. So we did a lot of work looking at the nutritional and mineral and metal profiles of different seaweeds. And you can just see here one of the images from the report reflecting, of course, on iodine differences in different species. And that was one of the early reports we did in a technical safety point of view. And if you jump forward 2 slides, because I know time is of the essence here, you'll see a recent report, more recent report, that Claire Winkle, who's in the audience today, was the coordinator and author of this project. And so she reviewed 2 of the seaweed production systems underway in Australia today. And you'll see the middle one there is a wild harvest kelp industry and outdoor drying. And you'll see the bottom right is more industrial, different species of seaweed, industrial drying processes. And so Claire outlined 2 HACCP flow charts about where the critical control points and safety points need to be around the industries. And this is available freely on the Australian government website. And then finally, Claire is also involved in this next slide. I think is pretty neat and important is that I jump forward another one, sorry, that Claire has been involved in as well. She's the chair of the committee of, I think we missed a slide there. If we go back, back one, sorry. Yeah. Oh no, I'm missing a slide there, sorry. I'm not sure where that went to, but there is a slide outlining the Australian aquatic plant name standards. So we have online with the Australian government like a fish name system. I'm sorry, we'll just have to go to the end of the deck, but I can send a link to it. The Australian aquatic plant name standards. And in Australia, we have a lot of Asian stores with seaweeds in the stores, and they are calling, kombu nori. And that could have safety issues, definitely. And also the sustainability and the nutritional issues will differ quite a lot. And so, that way it's nice that Australia has put into place some standards towards what are we calling these seaweeds in a common name, because most of the customers aren't going to be calling it, they call jellyweed instead of saying, Gelidium species and things like that, or sea lettuce instead of ulva. And like sea grapes is not the scientific name, of course. So what are the names and standards that we want to start calling seaweeds in the public space when they come into foods is really important to understand from a food safety point of view. So those are 3 areas I've just outlined and some reports that have taken us and that we're involved in to get the Australian seaweed industry up and going. And it's great just to be able to share that with a global network as Australia emerges onto the scene as one of the many amazing seaweed business opportunities in the world today. So you can go to the thank you slide and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Pia. That was terrific. Of course, seaweed farmers and seaweeds are the backbone of the sector. So really appreciate your having put that together, and some very interesting slides there. I think we'll all want to digest those more. And at the same time, some of you may have noticed a question from Philippe to Jamie and Nick. I saw that Jamie did see it. Nick, just in case you haven't, Philippe has asked you a question, and so please go ahead and follow that in the chat. Let's turn to Corentin. Over to you. Let's hear about Tahiti and Gracilaria. How are we doing, Corentin? You are muted.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry for that. So back again. Hello, my name is Corentin Salvant, and I am working with the Marine Resources Department of French Polynesia on development of local seaweed cultivation techniques. With the Marine Resources Department, we mainly focus on producing seaweed for food, but also work on the bioremediation of shrimp farm effluents. We currently work on Halimenia, Codium, Acanthophora, Ulva, and of course Gracilaria. Next one, please. So between 2022 and 2023, we've been working on designing commercial methods to produce gracilaria. Our goal was to produce a seaweed which will be sold fresh on the local food market. Next one, please. As you can see, we tried many production methods used around the world, but we've had many problems with epiphytes. Next one, please. Epiphytes are a real problem if you plan to sell fresh and processed seaweed on the food market, but we ended managing that and solving that epiphyte problem. So next one, please. After a year of trials, we ended up with 2 commercial cultivation methods, both compatible with the high cost of manpower in French Polynesia. So by mid-2023, we had a reliable production process, and we started to focus on post-harvest issues, such as food safety, of course. Next one, please. As you can see on this slide, our fresh gracilaria looks good and tasty, but at that time in 2023, we really didn't know if our production was safe. So we worked mostly on heavy metals and microbial safety. So next one, please. I'm just going to talk about heavy metals and microbial safety. On heavy metals first, on heavy metals, there is a French Polynesian law, but it only applies to seaweed used as ingredients in functional food. Apart from this law on functional food, there is nothing. But in French Polynesia, when there's no regulation yet, it's common practice to turn toward French and European Union regulations, and then later turn them into local law. Next one, please. So we checked heavy metals on our homegrown gracilaria, and as you can see in green, we are below all French standards, except for the European Union Regulation 231 on seaweed-based additives. We are above. The hazard index also suggested by Lydiane and Laura is also under 1, which is fine. So to conclude on heavy metals, as a local seaweed production is about to start here in Tahiti, maybe it's time for decision makers to adapt existing regulations and put them into the local law. Now I'm going to talk about microbial safety. Thank you. So there is no seaweed-specific regulation in French Polynesia, but vegetal material is usually divided in 3 categories: untransformed vegetables, processed vegetables, and vegetables mixed with animal material. Our fresh gracilaria is in the first category, which is untransformed vegetables. Untransformed vegetables, they do not require a use-by date or a best-before date. The packing plant has not to be certified by the authorities, and no aging test is required. Next one, please. In France, on the other hand, there is a microbial regulation specific to seaweeds, but it's on dry seaweed. Next one, please. In France, again, supermarkets and retailers have their own standards for untransformed vegetables. Unfortunately, seaweed isn't part of the distributor's standards yet, but other vegetables are, like lettuce and raw vegetables on this page, but also mixed salad on the next page. Next one, please. So we decided to run some aging tests on our product and see how it will compare to these standards, because there is always a possibility of having some animal epibionts packed with our fresh seaweed. We decided to use the more demanding standards on mixed salad rather than those on raw lettuce. Next one, please. So we ran our aging test on a seaweed packed this way. We checked all microbial standards listed by the distributor industry for mixed salad, and we did that daily for 10 days. So next one, please. None of the listed harmful species were detected. For total aerobic flora on this graphic, the industry upper limit was reached on day 8. But this is really what happens if the seaweed storage is optimal. If, for instance, temperature fall between 20 and 24 degrees at night, there will be some decay. Decay will usually show up sooner, and so does the bacterial load. So as a result, we recommend sticking to an informal best before date of only 4 days post-packing. This is because at 4 days, heavy microbial loads related with decay are very, very unlikely, even if storing temperatures are slightly incorrect, which is to expect in some stores. So we also suggest writing on the label to not refrigerate, to keep in airtight package at 25-30 degrees and consume fresh before the best before date. So to conclude, next one, please. Here is a little sum up of our main recommendations to farmers to improve food safety. As you can see, what I have shared with you today in orange is just a tiny part of the big picture. Our idea to compare fresh seaweed with mixed salad standards from the industry may sound a little weird, but at least I think it shows the need to clarify the legal status of seaweed within food regulations, especially the status of fresh seaweed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corentin. Thanks for keeping to time, which much appreciated. And I just want to give you a shout out for the, I loved the names of the various dishes, the heavy metal poke and the like. And you've got lots of great slides in here, and there's lots of interest in the presentations. So we do plan to share these presentations afterwards via the recording of this workshop, and would encourage anybody who's interested in the presentations to reach out to the presenters directly or to us, and we can facilitate that. So any quick questions? I see that there's been activity in the chat. We can continue with that so that we can turn now, unless there are burning questions for Pierre or Corentin, we can turn now to the pièce de résistance, as we would say, and let's get to the results and the recommendations of the South Passy project. I'm not seeing any Zoom hands, and therefore let's dive right in. Over to you, Lydiane.
Thank you, Nicolas. Melanie, can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So I am Lydiane Mathieu, from Blue Seaweed. I coordinated the South Passy project with Laura Lagourgue. Together we funded Caledonia, a seaweed company that is based in New Caledonia. The South Passy project was funded by the Global Seaweed Coalition. We also had got funding from the Fond Pacifique and the program Protège. Our partners were IRD, the University of French Polynesia, CSIRO, the Pacific Community, SPC, GSA in Wallis and Futuna, and DRM in French Polynesia. So it was a big regional project. Next, please. We had 3 main objectives. The first was to review food standards and regulations available for seaweed across the region. Second one was to acquire new data and assess the risk for seaweeds in French overseas, so specifically New Caledonia, Wallis and Futuna, and French Polynesia. And then our third objective was to produce recommendations and safety information on a selection of species in the form of fact sheets. We then plan to have a final workshop to share our findings and discuss the need for common standards and a regional working group. And that's what's happening today. Next, please. For our first objective, we made an exhaustive list of all food standards, recommendations, and regulations that are available for countries of the South Pacific. And we also looked into those of the big countries outside the region, such as the US or Asia, such as Japan, etc. We looked for maximum limits available for heavy metals, iodine, persistent organic pollutants, and pesticide residue, specifically for seaweeds, seaweed-based products and additives. And when they were not available, we looked into other foods. We then reviewed more than 75 scientific references in which we found values for these contaminants for over 150 tropical and cosmopolitan species. Next, please. Okay, so this table summarizes the maximum limits that we found Those specific for seaweeds are in green. Those seaweed-based products, which are different from seaweed-based additives, which are in brown, and other types of food are in blue. So what you can see is that in the South Pacific region, we've got three main regulators, if you can say, or recommendators. ANSES and the EU for the French overseas territories. We've got Food Safety Australia New Zealand for Australia New Zealand, of course, and the Codex for most other small countries of the region. France and Europe do provide up to 8 maximum limit for 8 contaminants, including total and inorganic arsenic, mercury, cadmium, lead, tin, iodine, and some pollutants as well. Food Safety Australia New Zealand only gives a limit for inorganic arsenic, which is more than twice the French limit, and the Codex doesn't provide any specific value for seaweeds. Not going into further details here, but the take-home message is that we don't have the same standards throughout the region, across the region. Also, the literature review I was telling you about showed that among these maximum limits that you can see in this table, we had they were exceeded in 2 to 70% of cases, depending on the metal considered, with inorganic arsenic and cadmium being those that are exceeded the most often. Next, please. So our second objective was to produce new data and establish, assess the risk and the benefits of a selection of species. To make it short, we collected and processed 282 samples for 33 species, for which we analyzed 22 heavy metals and other elements. We also analyzed a very large range of persistent organic pollutants and pesticide residues for 3 species. And from this very large data set that we got, we carried out a number of statistical analyses and calculated the hazard index that Corentin was mentioning earlier, as well as the 15% contribution to the nutritional reference value. Next, please. Melanie, can you? Oh, thank you. So very briefly, the hazard index sort of integrates the health risk that is associated to each contaminant into one reference value. If it's below 1, there is apparently no risk. And if it is above 1, there is a health risk to expect. We followed the work of Han et al. 2022, and the calculation takes into account the recommended reference doses from USEPA's IRIS database, as well as a daily consumption rate of 5 grams of dry seaweed per day for an average person of 70 kilos. Here we believe there is room for improvement, and that this hazard index could be adapted to more local consumption habits, which we don't know about. Like maybe in the Pacific, we don't eat 5 grams per day and per person, and maybe the average weight is not 70 kilograms, so there's room for improvement. Next slide, please. So what did we find? This is a summarized view of our results for green algae. In the third column, we've put in red all the elements above the maximum limit for seaweed-based products, as recommended by ANSES in France, for which we've got the largest maximum limit data set. But you must know that all species that we've got, except 1 or 2, exceed the 3 milligram per kilogram total arsenic limit that is set by the EU for seaweed-based food additives. But we don't show them here because we were more interested in like raw seaweed and seaweed products that we actually eat directly. The fourth column in this table is for pesticide and pollutants, sorry. Then you have the hazard index, and the last column gives a list of nutrients that reach the 15% nutritional reference value, meaning that the elements listed here significantly contribute to our daily needs. So we can sort of claim the particular seaweed is beneficial for this particular nutrient. If you look closely, we have species of the same genus that have different results. For instance, in New Caledonia, we've got Caulerpa geminata on the second row. that tends to accumulate a lot of elements, including inorganic arsenic, which leads to a bad hazard index. While Coleopter oligophylla, also in New Caledonia, is safe to eat, but it's not so interesting from a nutritional point of view. What's also interesting in that table is Cladophora in about the middle of the table, which has too much cadmium, but a good hazard index. And it is the other way around for Ulva towards the bottom of the table, where you've got, there's no maximum limit exceeded and the hazard index is not good. This is because the hazard index integrates the risk for more elements than those for which we've got maximum limits. Also, here we really would like to raise the importance of having data for all elements to be able to give a secured diagnostic for species. As you can see, we've got some species where data is missing and we couldn't make conclusions on these ones. It's not comparable with the other ones. Next, please. So that's some results for the red seaweeds. What's interesting here is, for example, Acanthophorus pixifera, which we have in New Caledonia and Wallis and Futuna. You can see that the New Caledonian one accumulates too much inorganic arsenic, whereas the Wallisian one, the problem is cadmium. So again, we've got same species, but different problems. Asparagopsis taxiformis is interesting, tends to accumulate quite a bit of elements, too much inorganic arsenic, iodine, and cadmium. But interestingly, the hazard index again is good. Most of the gracilarias that we've looked at are apparently safe. Next one, please. For bone seaweed, it's a different story, with most of the species above the limit for inorganic arsenic and a bad hazard index, which is a pity because they are very interesting from a nutritional point of view. The only exception seems to be Podaina in Wallis and Futuna, but we didn't measure pollutants on that particular in Wallis and Futuna. So, and this appears to be a problem in the Podaina in New Caledonia. So there's something to check there. Now we know that the measures we've taken are from raw biomass, and some of the contaminants from what we've seen in the literature through a process, when you process them into a final product, you can wash out a part of the contaminants, and the final product might not contain as much. That's something we really would like to quantify in our local seaweeds. Next slide, please. So from these results, we've produced fact sheets for a set of 9 species. We've selected the species that we thought were the most interesting for the region. These fact sheets contain a number of sections, including strengths, weaknesses, and recommendations. They have not been edited yet, but we hope they'll be available before the end of the year. Next slide, please. So finally, we listed some recommendations or perspectives that we believe are worth pursuing. The first is that we believe the industry would benefit from harmonized maximum limits, which would help regional commercial exchanges. Then we believe the hazard index can be a very good tool to estimate safe doses that can be consumed, but it must take into account all contaminants and has to be adapted to fit local consumption habits. And I will finish with the third point, which is to produce local data to identify local strengths and weaknesses, because we've seen a lot of variability between localities, and we really can't tell that, for example, Coleopter or Ulva is always safe everywhere. Yeah, and finally, during the second part of this workshop, we would like to check with you whether we should build a working group to address these points and many others. Next slide, Melanie. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and being with us today. Thank to our partners, and particularly the Global Coalition, for their support in this project and the co-organization of this workshop. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lydiane. That was terrific. And you will not have seen probably, but there's quite a bit of interest. So you've got a couple of questions in the chat. And before I turn to the questions, I really want to thank the members of our Scientific Council and our Strategic Advisory Council for their, first of all, for joining and for your active engagement. So just want to flag that the chair of our Strategic Advisory Council, Anushka Concepcion, managed to join after some unexpected technical issues getting in, but between her and Melanie and a little bit of coordination from yours truly, she's in. And great to see you here, Loretta. Great to see you here, Elena, in your double capacity as a member of our Strategic Advisory Council, as well as, of course, the president of the International Seaweed Association. So let's turn to the questions now, very quickly. So the first one was actually from Elena. So why don't you go ahead and ask your question online, Elena?
Me? No.
Yep, that was you.
The question. Yeah, the question on the chat. Sorry. Hi, everyone. So I was wondering, Lydiane, great presentation. First, congratulations on your work. Regarding the analytical data, are those was the sampling done by you and the analysis done by you, or was it literature review? Sorry if you said it and I missed it.
Yeah, no. We started with a literature review of all tropical and cosmopolitan species to check what there was elsewhere. And then we did like an extensive sampling in New Caledonia, Wallis Futuna, and French Polynesia with more than 22 elements. So we've got a big data set for these countries.
Okay, so the table is based in your information,
Yeah.
in your analytical.
Yes, the table.
And you did, and then Alan makes the next question because it's integrated anyway. So I let him. Thank you.
So we'll turn to Alan. This is a really great contribution. It's one of the areas that we think is important for governments to pay attention to, this kind of basic research that's being done that is a public good, and we think that it's important that that governments contribute financially to it. That was my commercial. Alan, over to you for your question.
It was about just the representativity of the sampling, because it's important when you raise issues of heavy metals. There's a chance to scare the public, but how representative are the samples, and is the variability geographically as well as season, even in tropical areas, the seasonal variation? And I'm not sure we do enough sampling. I know that the analyses are expensive, but we need to get the sampling right.
Yes, maybe Laura, do you want to reply? Or well, we've done for New Caledonia, we had the biggest sampling for New Caledonia. We did 2 seasons before and after the rainy season, and we targeted like 10 species. We've had more in Fiji, but like 3 contested sites, like coastal, intermediate, and reef crest of reef. And at each site we sampled 5 distant populations, which we mixed together, and we had 3 replicates. So in the end, it's quite a lot of samples per species. We can always do more, but we spend most of the budget on analysis. So and they are very expensive indeed.
But they are indeed. But bravo, because from what you just said, I think you've got representative sampling there, and which is a lot better than many other people. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific. So now, with all of that background, it's time for us to shift gears. If there aren't any more questions, and it doesn't look like there are any, and of course, if somebody has a burning question that comes up during the brainstorming, we ask it. But let's turn now to the 3 questions that Lydiane and Laura and we in the Global Seaweed Coalition are really keen to get your input, your thoughts on. So let me just, once again, the 3 questions are contaminants a threat to the development of the seaweed industry in the region? Second one is, are common regional guidelines needed? And is a regional working group needed? Now, we might want to dig a little bit deep into those, because we might very quickly come to affirmative answers on them, is my guess. But let's turn now. Let's talk for about 10 minutes or so on contaminants and the kinds of threat or not that they might pose to the development of the seaweed industry in the region. Anybody want to go first? Or fair warning, I might pick on some of you if nobody's speaking. So feel free to already raise your hands. All right, picking on you is about to occur. Nick, you didn't present on contaminants, but now you get an opportunity to, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the role that contaminants might play in the development of the industry.
Look, it's an interesting one, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. It's not something that we're really focused on, but just listening to Lydiane, and I really liked that approach about the hazard index. I don't understand exactly how it was calculated, and I think we all probably need to know that, but that it's the multi-element approach. It's not just individual elements and thresholds, which is an oversimplification. So I think that's really important, and exactly what we were just picking up on with the discussion with Alan is we just need more data. Like it's the main thing, and centralized and accessible, and of course the methods that were used to analyze these things, because they're actually all different at times. Even these technical machines that measure the elements are one thing, but there's different ways of extracting it as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, but we have to start somewhere, and so it's really pleasing to see that synthesis.
And it so often comes down to the issue of the paucity of the data and the issue of the quality of whatever data exists. Elena.
Hi. Yeah, I was going in the same direction as Nick just mentioned, because in fact, and I put this hat now because I was involved in the starting the seaweed farming and also use of seaweed for food here in Portugal, and in fact, one of the things that we really had to do was a bit of what Lydiane showed, and also Cotrin, because in fact, and it's still happening in Europe, because the difficulty is to have standard methods that everyone is using, to have certain labs that really can reassure you with the results they are providing you. And many times we would send replicas of exactly the same, not even mixing populations, but the same tank of seaweed that we were farming to different labs, and the results would be different. And that all it comes out to how used to are they doing extraction procedures for seaweed biomass, and then adapting, also not adapting the procedures, but most of it has to do with extraction, in fact, methodologies. And then another question, I think it's also not to be scared, and this is just a kind of advice, with the first results you're getting, and do not hamper any further development from just based on these results, because there are, as you mentioned, different limits across the region. There are different limits across globally, and in fact, that's why I like the approach of Cotrin. Many people have been using, for instance, trying to sell fresh seaweed, but then using limits that are used for dried seaweed in France, that some of the seaweeds not even are the same, or they're grown in the same way. The equivalences between dried and fresh are different. People use different ratios. So I think we really need to go with with your historical data, do a huge effort in the analytical, in the sampling and analytical, and then try to look at what has been done in other countries in terms of standardization. And there's, I put that in the chat also. In Europe here, there was the European Committee of Standardization was doing a great job looking at, with different groups from all the European countries, looking not only at literature, but at the Codex Alimentarius, and most important, historical analytical data from several institutions, including companies and the research centers. And this can really help to, I hope, in some way, to change the limits at some point, because some of the limits we are aware that are wrong and are not comparable. We are using them for seaweed, but they are below the limits that are used for other foods that we eat every day. So the advice is not to hamper future developments. Just take it as a starting point and really try to increase collaboration with other
Thank you,
countries.
Elena. I think there's quite a bit of interest in hearing from Claire as well. I don't know if you knew that, Claire, but there is.
Well, I'm in awe of the presentations I've seen this morning, especially Ladain's work where she's actually done the testing on South Pacific species. I think that's really what was needed. For me, the work that I've done so far, the previous project, as Pia mentioned, was with one wild harvested species and one Pia's land grown species. And we looked at different types of control points that could be done by the either the growers, the harvesters, the processors. And I'm not seeing the work we found the same similar hazards everyone else is talking about. The only other one I would say was allergens, like little shellfish and little crabs, particularly if they're seed grown or wild harvested. You can have those tiny little like mussels and crabs. Now, if you're drying them and then milling them, crushing, something like that, if you haven't done a step to get the little animals off, you're going to have an undeclared allergen or possibly two or more. And now this isn't hard and fast, but what seems to work with that is just dipping them in fresh water. Whereas I notice the gentleman from Tahiti, he talked about a wash step with seawater. So my question would be seawater or fresh water. And so that's the kind of area where that's probably the only hazard that we picked up that hasn't really met. Freshwater well, see, that's species specific issue. It's freshwater kills Gracilis in 15 minutes. That's an important issue. So that's the type. I didn't know that because I've not worked with that species. UV filtered seawater, excellent. So the only other thing I'd mention, which is probably important with regard to the regional workshops, is I'm also on a committee in the US, and they are developing the Seaweed Hazards Guide. So I think, and obviously they're very Northern Hemisphere focused, but I think this group and that group should work together. Yep, okay, some more comments about freshwater. So yeah, so this is the thing, different species, different effects, and how are you using it? We've already heard like Helena talk about, okay, we've got some standards in some parts of the world for dried, not necessarily relevant for eating fresh. And in my current project, we've got some pharmaceutical processors who are using highly refined powdered seaweed as one of their ingredients. And then they're being forced to meet regulations that are designed for dried seaweed. And so their product's quite concentrated, so they regularly don't meet that. So I totally agree with what previous speakers have said about inconsistencies in the regulations and then the application of those regulations against products that they're not designed for. And it's a great comment also about the inconsistencies in the European labs, because those Pia would probably be able to tell us how many labs in Australia could actually do any of these tests and what methods are they using.
So thank you very much, especially because I just put you on the spot there. You might have known about that. But good to see Anushka contributing in the chat on this.
Excellent.
Just to flag, she's with NOAA, so great that you flagged that, and great that she's going to be able to take you up on that. Before we move on to the next question, there is also, can we focus on consumption data, whether it's at the regional or the local level? Any issues that anybody wants to, or national, so regional, national, or local levels? Anybody want to point to any issues with data about consumption?
I think, sorry, Nicola, I think the question is more about, we don't know how much is is how much do people consume on a regular basis. We've got this data from a paper. We know what they consume in Asia, but like in the South Pacific, how much do people eat seaweed? And it's probably different between countries as well. Does anyone have data or like knows more or less what people eat in the South Pacific Islands?
I'm actually going to start with an answer on this that relates to my work on terrestrial agriculture and food security. And this points to the need for better linkages between terrestrial and aquatic food systems discussions, because there are regular surveys about what people eat that tend to focus on the terrestrial. There's a food insecurity experience scale, which is something that people are surveyed about what they have eaten and how much in a day. And that is run by a group in FAO. So they are amenable to including seaweed in their conversation. So I just wanted to insert that in there. So thanks, Lydiane, for posing that question. I'm seeing lots of action on that in the chat. Does anybody want to contribute anything? Bodhi.
Yeah, I would like to share the seaweed first consumption in Indonesia, because if you look at especially the heavy metal, yes, sometimes we are worried about the heavy metal contents. But if we look at based on our research with many universities, and there is a lot of research on the heavy metal that in some area usually is also changing. Even though when we have some case study with the companies from Philippines in 2008, yeah, they have a complaint on the cadmium content from seaweed from Indonesia, but currently when they are sourcing in the same place and on the location, there is no complaint anymore. It's changing based on the seasonality and also the time and also the practices of the farmers. Yeah. And the others, I also look at that based on the traditional food. Yeah, we have a lot of variety of seaweed in Indonesia, like Colerpa, Ulva, and also Gracilaria, even the Spinosum and Cavapicus. We we consume the fresh seaweed in many places in our province, like in Bali, in Lombok, and in South Sulawesi, in North Java, and they don't have any problem with this kind of the heavy metal issues. We also look at that there is possibility to reduce the heavy metal during the process, yeah. Especially when we look at that there is a risk in the health risk, yeah. We can do it like the extraction, fermentation, and also washing with the hot waters, yeah, especially using the sea waters, not fresh waters, yeah. And with this kind of the method and experience of our local farmers and also people in the coastal community, we can learn and no worries about the issues of the heavy metals. That's my sharing from the Indonesian. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. That's great to know. And if you have any access to some data sources that would be of interest to the group, maybe put the websites in the chat. And I think we can, Lydiane, if you don't mind, I think we can conclude that better data would certainly help us to have a better development of the industry in the region. I'm not sure that anybody would disagree with that statement. If you do, please put up your hand. But let's maybe turn now to our second big question, and that is, do we need common regional guidelines? So would welcome your thoughts. Does anybody have a strong views about regional guidelines? Maybe somebody who hasn't spoken yet, but who knows about this stuff. Melanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on the last point, just to understand what can be the support of the codex in doing more analysis and supporting all those analysis if Esther is still online to talk through that.
And Esther, we did want you to spell out the acronym that you put, if you are still there. I think she's not. Oh no, she is. But she's gone dark, so she might have stepped away. All right, it's a good question, Melanie. Let's see whether, if we are not able to get it during this session, let's have it as a follow-up. So let's turn to the need for common regional guidelines. I mean, we as the Global Seaweed Coalition are constantly relaying the need for harmonization at the global level. What about at the regional level? What differences might it make? So since we don't have right now, since we don't have Esther, let's maybe, Corentin, what do you think about this? And we just got a post from Esther that she's leaving.
Sorry. Yes, obviously, the work from Lydiane and Laura is very interesting for us in Tahiti. So there is a need for a regional group that gathers all the data we talked about. I think everyone will benefit from a platform to share all that data. Of course, analysis methods will be different, but it's still interesting to see that, for instance, today I learned that Acanthophora in New Caledonia might be a bit high in organic arsenic, you know. So of course I'm going to check mine. I'm going to check the one I'm cultivating right now. But to know that, it's just triggering a little red light, and that information is always interesting. So having a regional group and gathering often, and having a cloud to share some common analysis, and maybe share regularly on what we've done and what regulations were changed in our country. That's always interesting. Now, how do we do it really concretely?
So I think you jumped to the third question on that.
Oh,
which is, I mean, I think we're expecting a yes answer on that, by the way. But what about regional guidelines? Do we need to have specific regional guidelines, or should we be focusing on global, or what level is important?
That would be difficult, because as mentioned, we have a specific seaweed species. The way we eat them is sometimes very different. For example, here we are working on a gracilaria that will be sold fresh, so we have problems. For example, I heard before that crabs might be an allergen, but crabs in fresh seaweed might also be increasing microbial loads, and it's a totally different business than vegetable microbial related, you know. So I think we are very specific. So guidelines at a regional level might be difficult, but still interesting, yes.
Okay, great. And let's actually, Gemma, if you're still online, be interested in your perspective on this. We still have Gemma. So looks like you're here.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I would agree on going with the discussions that everyone is on. I think for the region itself and the region that I represent, that would be beneficial and useful, in fact, to have a more regional sort of approach towards addressing the issue. And thank you everyone for the sharing as well. I think I'm quite new to this, the information that's been shared, and whatever has been shared has been very useful in terms of understanding also much of what the other issues and challenges with other areas and other regions as well in other countries. So thank you so much for all the presentations.
Thanks, Gemma. And I see your hand, Melanie, but let me turn to Loretta first. I see you've posted in the chat, Loretta.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. I just mentioned that maybe not, it's a complicated region, so having a common set of guidelines may not be appropriate, but they do have a lot of similar species, so maybe that shared list of those species, the names, identification, and common names that are used would be helpful to understand what is what.
Already helpful, right, to get everybody on the same page. And Claire, it sounds like that's where you want to go as well.
Yes, given that I think Australia is the only country with a standard of aquatic plant names document. Now it's voluntary here, it's not mandatory. Oh, you did it in oh wow, another one in Portugal. That's fantastic. So just coming here and finding that out. And then one thing that we talked about was whether we were going to add First Nations names to our list. But even within Australia, that's incredibly diverse because of different species being used by different groups in completely different ways. But it's a starting point.
Great. Okay, Melanie, now you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I just posted the question in the chat about it's more a curiosity. Where do you run your analysis in the Pacific? Do you have standard set of method? Maybe it was raised in the presentation, but it's a question that has been raised when Lydiane said this project on where can we run the analysis. Is there a standardized method? And I know it's a project we supported in the Americas as well, because it was problematic since, for example, in Brazil, they didn't have the same method, so very different data on heavy metals than in the north. So for the Pacific, I wonder, since the region is very broad.
And in addition to that, are there any contaminants that require more attention than others? So I see Elena nodding vigorously there.
Just to Corentin is saying that he did his in Brest. That's what we did as well. We did part of the heavy metal analysis locally in Numea at IRD because there's a specific lab that can do that. And then we did part of the analysis, or another part of the analysis in Brest as well. And we've got some overlap for some of the heavy metals that allow us to compare, but not for all of them, obviously. Yeah. But yeah, obviously in the Pacific, when you're a French overseas territory, the easiest is to go for a lab in France where they've got standards and all that.
So I'm conscious of time. Lydiane, before we turn to the regional working group and maybe fleshing out what that might look like, is there anything else burning that you would like this group to begin to speak about? Or are we good to turn to the regional working group?
No, I guess we're good to turn to the regional working group, because if we do decide that we want a working group, then we can discuss all the questions.
Exactly, because a lot is coming up here, and I'm sure that if a working group were to be constituted, then an initial meeting would build on this brainstorming and might establish in terms of reference. But let's because I'm seeing lots of interesting contributions in the chat. So let's turn to that working group, a regional working group. Who would need to be involved? What form might that take? Initial thoughts on that? Maybe from somebody who has led a regional working group, if there is such an individual. I mean, I've led plenty of working groups, but not regional ones. Okay, so we don't, so maybe turn to Gemma and Jamie, given that you do have this regional representation, and I wasn't going to leave you alone, Elena, but if you don't mind waiting and seeing whether Jamie, any thoughts on this?
Sure. I think regionalism is quite important considering the scale of the industry and trying to access room markets or international markets as a region, and building up the volume that's required to kind of have some sort of say in the market as well is quite important. It's been difficult to try and set up, I guess, standing regional agreements because most of these aquaculture industries in the Pacific tend to be quite small. And so it's not a preoccupation of government or anything like that. And also quite expensive as well to try and get people to meet and that sort of thing. There are some conduits, and so SPC holds a technical meeting every couple of years for coastal fisheries and stuff like that. And seaweed could be a focus of one of those meetings. So we tend to rotate focus around commodities and issues both in coastal fisheries and aquaculture. And so SPC can provide a good basis for that kind of connection. But yeah, agreements are difficult but needed. I mean, I support it. There is some kind of interest at the moment with some of the Pacific's partners, particularly New Zealand, in trying to have a regional aquaculture hub. And yes, seaweed would be very much one of the commodities that would be of great interest to a regional hub because it's applicable to most of the countries.
Okay, thank you. And let me just see whether Gemma, you have any thoughts about what a regional working group might look like, as in who might participate? What level are we talking about? Government representatives? Are we talking about seaweed stakeholders, scientists only? Any thoughts? And I do see, and I'm going to come in on something afterwards with a suggestion as well. But if Gemma, you've got any additional suggestions, most welcome.
Well, thank you, Nicola. I think just listening to Jamie summed it up very well for the Pacific context. And just from experience, I think getting the government involved, and especially with the kind of organization, the intergovernmental organization that we oversee, it's through the government that we can sort of bring together such regional collaboration, and that's where our strength would be. In terms of industry, at the moment, as Jamie highlighted, it's quite small within certain of our member countries, and so I think the government agencies would be sort of a key in terms of leading such regional approach. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Before we turn to some of the other contributions, I want to put in there for consideration the role of other kinds of international organizations, such as the ones who hold the purse strings or can help with that. So thinking about the Rome-based agencies, FAO, potentially also IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is increasingly getting into aquatic foods, and then potentially also the World Bank, with whom we are collaborating increasingly, because they might be able to find ways to incorporate the creation of new institutional structures in some of the project work that they finance. The World Bank working differently from most other organizations in that they finance actions by government rather than taking them on themselves. So that's one. Or another approach would be to see if Australia or other governments are receptive to help support the creation of such working groups, because they do at some point involve. So virtual meetings are good. At some point, usually it's important to get together, and that takes funding. So these are a couple of thoughts. Is also look to both the multilateral donors and to the bilateral donors to get them engaged and get them to support this kind of work. Corentin, I'm curious. Forum Discord with subcategories, which I see that there are 3 thumbs up, which means that there are 3 people who know what you mean. I'm not one of them. So.
Yeah, well, I'm just going from what I've experienced during the past 4 years when we developed this commercial protocol for Gracilaria. It's sometimes I had the feeling that I was doing things from scratch, like when we had this commercial protocol running fine, but we didn't know anything about food safety and food safety specifically for seaweed. So I just talked with people in my network, but that's not the most dynamic way, I think, to get a reply. You know, if you have a group with people that maybe will give you an answer quickly and share on the same page the same problematics, that will be interesting. I think it will be a bit more responsive than just see, maybe I know this person, I think he worked on something similar, you know, or maybe just do the literature work, which is always the basis of everything, you know. But I think on something like that, maybe we could also have a cloud with on which we share some analysis, you know. For instance, this year we are going to run gracilaria heavy metal analysis using different protocols for production, like we have at sea or in tanks. In tanks, we have different type of fertilizations, and well, I'm willing to share that information, and maybe someone had a similar issue, you know, and it could be quicker to talk on a forum and Discord group than turning first to the literature and the scientific literature, you know.
And let's not miss the opportunity of the codex, as Esther has rightly pointed out, and as Melanie and others have been emphasizing in the chat. We do have this immediate opportunity, so let's perhaps see whether we can formulate something as we individually reach out to our codex representatives, because everybody on this call is going to find out who their codex counterparts are and are going to contact them, right? I'm seeing some nods. Want to see more nods. So really do please make sure to reach out to your codex representatives. There's a huge opportunity here, and it's not certain that that seaweed is going to be as fully taken into account as we would like. So let's do what we can. Let's get them to be very happy about seaweed. Excellent. Thank you, Elena. That's very good. So it's getting time to wrap up. We started a little bit late, but if does anybody have anything absolutely burning that they would like to contribute at this point? The 30-second version of the contribution.
How do we find out who our codex reps are again?
I wish that Esther
The
were
link.
still.
I shared the link in the chat, but
Yes, yes. Melanie shared the link and they would just go there. That's how I saw that was the gap. Yeah.
Okay,
I
excellent.
would just give a very quick, not burning, but positive intention for the regional creation, because here in Portugal we didn't have an association before, so we were just different players in the seaweed and the microalgae, trying to go along with these standardizations and the food safety questions and the market and the consumers. And the moment we created the association, it's much easier not only to discuss and to share information, but also to take our opinion as one to the legislators, to the international bodies. So it's really something that I would advise everyone to do. If it doesn't exist one, many it's not good, but if there's no entity, to create one is always a very good, always has positive outcomes, in my opinion.
Excellent advice. And just so you know, I'm going to be, since I'm based in Washington, I'm going to be speaking with as many people as I can in the embassies here who are involved in fisheries and the like. There are ag and fisheries counselors here who are now more interested in seaweed than they were, so I'm happy to relay it to them. And there are the upcoming World Bank annual meetings where delegations will be present. And it's unfortunate that our colleague Harrison wasn't able to join. He's another member of the Strategic Advisory Council. He's the World Bank's representative to the council. So we'll also relay some of this information to him, so that when the World Bank is meeting with the delegations, we'll hope that some of this also is transmitted to them. And then, of course, Bodhi, there's now, we're so excited about Indonesia's taking the reins, the leadership reins, in calling for that UN task force on seaweed. And we can see, Melanie, you and I can take a look at how we're teeing that work up and see whether we might want to insert something into there about this work on contaminants in general, and maybe some specific South Pacific work that we could make sure is incorporated into the work of the task force. So with that, I really want to thank everybody. This has been extremely rich, and I think as we review the recording, we're going to see so much in here. I know that a lot passed me by in my role as moderator. I missed some things. I'm going to want to go back and take a look at much of what was discussed. Lydiane, really want to thank you for putting this together. It's been a very rich, very grounded in science, as we are in the Global Seaweed Coalition, and very pragmatic and practical as well, which is, I think, a hallmark of much of the work on seaweed that happens. We're going to be, when I say we collectively, the organizers, Lydiane and the Global Seaweed Coalition, will be putting out a report on it that could just be a recording of it. And I say ordinarily we would do a summary, but at this point we are financially strapped, and our communications manager is now operating on a volunteer basis, and so asking him to do a report on this is a little bit much. But thank you to all of you. So if you do know of some immediate funding sources that could help with carrying us through this period until the task force is created, we would welcome your support on that. But thank you to all of you for your for joining us, for your active participation, your engagement. It's been terrific. Really huge thanks to all of our speakers, every one of you, the wonderful quality of the presentations. Extra special thanks to Lydiane from Blue Seaweed, leading the organization of this workshop, together with our own Melanie Kreff. Excuse me. And of course, for those who know our workshops, you know that I wouldn't let us leave without a promotional word about the Global Seaweed Coalition. If you are not already a member, please join. It's free. It's easy. The website I posted it in the chat way at the beginning. There's a link in there. You can find a tab to become a member, and that will get you access to bi-weekly news on seaweed, to invitations to our events, to the ability to go and noodle around in our collaboration platform, Ubuntu. Thank you once again. We hope that you found this event informative and that it inspired you to contribute even more to this important agenda for the Pacific and for seaweed in general. Thank you, Loretta. I love it. Please reach out to any of us if you'd like to discuss further. And by us, I mean myself, Melanie, Philippe, and Lydiane. And let me put Laura in that as well. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much, and goodbye.